All right, welcome everybody. We are live through the magic of Skype with the Honorable Mayor of Westfield, Daniel Knapik. Dan, welcome.
Thank you, Steve. It's a pleasure to be Skyping with you today.
Absolutely. This is very cool indeed.
This is
So
our
we're going to
second.
go ahead.
This is our second Skype out of the mayor's office.
That's great. So you're into this kind of stuff, huh?
Well, you got to be today, I guess.
So we're talking for the next 10 or 15 minutes about the budget in Westfield. It's budget time. And for the last few years, there's been quite a bit of dust up around this time of year, around the budget, and this year is no different. Before we get into what's going on this year, though, let's talk about the basics. For the folks who don't follow the budget, what is the budget and how is it created?
Well, the budget is the financial document that sets the, if you will, for lack of a better word, the spending priorities for the city. And that's the principal responsibility of the mayor to establish that. It funds our personnel costs and our expenses related to running the city and all our other obligations like pension, health insurance, and retirement funds.
And when does the process start? What time of year do we get going with the
Well,
budget?
yeah, since I've been in office, we generally start it. We have a departmental meeting in February, and I set kind of the parameters for the department managers to follow as they go through their budget. And kind of concurrently to the local effort is the effort at the state level. So typically in January, the governor announces what his budget is, and he has benchmarks in there for guidance. And then usually in early March, the House of Representatives has issued their benchmarks to follow for the budget. And then sometime in early May, the Senate follows suit. So the problem has been, obviously, because the economy has been difficult, over the years, not all three line up. And so what the House and Senate have been able to do the last couple of years is kind of early in that process, sometime in early April or thereabouts, or May, or mid-May, April, is to issue a joint release indicating for local aid numbers, here's roughly where we believe we're going to be at. Don't expect to be more than that, but don't expect to be any less than that. But of course, you don't know it all until the gavel drops ending the session on the fiscal year and they pass the budget. That's when you absolutely know what you got. But it's enough to plan. So we start that process, and the departments go through March working on their numbers and capital ideas and all that. And usually by mid-April is when I start to ask for a submission so that we can begin reviewing it. And usually from mid-April to the end of May thereabouts is all in my hands with the auditor.
Now, you're a veteran of this process. How many budgets have you been a part of over the
Well,
years?
this is my fifth one. So
Well, even before that, right? You were city councilor, and
yeah, eight years on the council. So it's not a new process, but of course, as a councilor, the document's been completed. And you know what? I think a lot of times council members don't appreciate is really the job, as I learned it when I was there, was to take a vote, yes or no, not to make the budget or create the budget. You certainly can give your input to the mayor, but if you're going to take a position that we should not fund, say 1.5 million, well, I'd certainly like to know how you're not going to fund that. Where would you think that we should go? 80 to 85% of the budget's tied up in personnel. The balance of it is in fixed costs. You take that kind of money out of a $119 million document, you're going to be talking body counts.
and correct me if I'm wrong. You mentioned back in February you go to the department heads,
Yeah.
and you outline what your requirements are for the budget. And if I'm not
Uh,
mistaken, you tell them to level fund the budget. Is that right?
yeah. So since I've been in office, we haven't had a robust amount of money coming into the coffer. So, you've got to finance the things that keep you at a minimum functioning, your supplies, your fuel costs for the genie and all that kind of stuff, or if you have vehicles, your fleet costs, and then cover your salary situation. And if some department has a special ask, then they have to get clearance and permission before I let it put it in. So There's two departments that want to share a clerical position in the budget that I proposed this year.
Mm-hmm.
So they asked for permission ahead of time. They each wanted their own clerical full time, but the way it works is that there wasn't enough money, so we'll at least get it on board half time. This year was a little bit different because, unlike in past years, most of the collective bargaining agreements were wrapped up before I made the budget. So the instructions given to them in February was that the budget that you submit to me, unless you have special permission otherwise, should not include any more in it. Even with the new salaries, I'd asked them on the salary adjustments to cover in their budget, find the money to cover their own personnel salary adjustments.
Mm-hmm.
That was this year's marching order.
And we hear a lot of claims that spending in the city is out of control. Do you think that's true from your perspective?
No, of course not. What I would say is
where are these claims coming from? Why do they exist? And how do they get out there into the community? How do these rumors start?
I think it's obviously a lot of it's politics, and I think for a lot of folks, a lack of understanding of what's the city doing, what's in the budget. So, for instance, we've had a very slow rate of growth in the city budget from 2009 to 2014. I mean, there was a couple of years there it was under a percent, but that's because we had held the line on collective bargaining agreements,
mm-hmm.
0, 1s, 0.5%. But that was only going to last so long. So in the latest contract cycle, the communities around us were granting 2.5%, or roughly between 5 and 6% for a 3-year period. Well, so when our groups go in to negotiate, they're not unwise to what's going on in the world around us. And essentially, that's what we ended up getting across the board, was a 5 to a 5.5% over 3 years. And so right out of the gate, if you increase 1 or 2% in salary, that's automatically going to jump your budget up. So that's an issue. The other one is the retired teachers' contribution for their health insurance. That's an assessment that comes from the state, and that goes up. We don't control that year over year. The other one is set by the pension board refunding schedule every year. That went up quite a bit this year. So there's a certain amount of fixed costs that you don't have any control over. I mean, some people say, well, you have control over collective bargaining. You really don't. You're going to get jammed up, and if your counteroffer is unreasonable, it'll eventually catch up to you. There's no question. Some people think, well, give them zeros. Well, you can't give them zeros. That we did have a couple of zero runs in there, but that was at the low point of the economy. So those days are over. So you got to get beyond that. And so the other driver in our budget is the debt service to repair all of our buildings. So, when I came in office, that number was about $7 million, and in the last 4 years, it went down to about 4.5 or so million. And it's not like you save that money. That money gets used somewhere else in the budget to cover another gap. And so what's happened with all the borrowing that we've done to fix our buildings, we're now up to just under 7 million again, which is about the sweet spot that you want to be so that you can continue to fix things you need to fix. And but the biggest challenge for those of us in local government is the lack of local aid. So in 2008, the local aid state contribution was maybe in the mid 40s% of our budget. And then what's happened now, all these years later, property tax is now to make up for that, because the aid is down by about $2.5 million. Property tax is now well over 50% of your budget. And, there were a lot of debates in the Prop 2.5 years about that relationship between cities and towns. Now that revenue generation was capped by Prop 2.5, the state needed to be a full partner in the year-over-year growth. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the Mass Taxpayers Foundation, I think, had indicated that year-over-year growth in local aid in Chapter 70 was in the neighborhood of like 5 to 7% prior to the recession. Mm-hmm. It's just barely gotten to like 2 to 2.5%. So real dollar values, as a for instance, we had $7.85 million in 08 in unrestricted local aid. For this year, it's $5.6 million. So it's a lot less, but your cost centers are, they continue to escalate on you.
And so times are tight. I think you would concur with that.
Well, there is a bright spot. One is it's health insurance.
Yep.
Our year-over-year annual growth on health insurance has been about 1%, which is fantastic. And actually, in the proposed budget this year, it only goes up by 1%, and that's a recommendation to go up 1% because the actual estimate was to be either level funded or have some deflation in it. But the trustees that run the health insurance trust want to start putting some money away for retired health insurance, and that's why they went to a 1%.
So, the city council, they're going to be holding a hearing at 6:30 on Thursday, and the city council meeting on following that at 7 o'clock. I believe they're going to be voting on the budget this Thursday. Is that right?
So 2 members are absent from that meeting, so I think they'll probably have a special meeting the week after. Mm-hmm. It's awfully difficult to announce cuts and then not fully understand what those cuts mean and then take the budget vote. I mean, I was on the council for 8 years and we never did anything like that. We always waited to if there was a proposed cut in the week before, we waited to the last week of the fiscal year to have the meeting so that the members of the finance committee could inform the council at large what the ramification is. As you remember last year.
That was my next question. What do they want to cut? Do we even know?
Right. Well, like last year, I asked the department heads going into it, was there a sense that they wanted to cut anything? And they all said no. They didn't ask us. And the next thing you know, 2 days before the big meeting, they announced that they were going to cut, 1.2% or something, or whatever it was, and trim all these things by some even amount, all these different expense and salary accounts. And in the end, they couldn't do it. They heard from the departments what that would mean. And so I hope that the finance chairman this year, if there are any cuts that end up getting passed on Thursday night, come back to me, and as I'd asked the chairman last year, come back to me before you propose a cut so I can explain to you what might happen. So we'll see.
And that's been a real problem in the past, hasn't it? Just a real lack of communication with some of the counselors, who are making decisions without running it past department heads and consulting with you. Do you see that as part of the problem of these budget battles that we seem to have year after year?
There's no question. I think there's been a certain agenda that cut, but they don't want to ask what the ramifications are. So I said every year, I'm available before I submit the budget, which I met with a couple of members this year, and in the past I was available. He said, all I ask is to be given notice ahead of time so I can tell you what will happen. I find it interesting, Springfield's budget passed, no cuts. Holyoke, the council went into that meeting wanting to cut $4 million without any layoffs. That was last night. Well, they got to midnight and they had cut a grand total of 100 Gs. Because really the bottom line is that if you're going to take out any substantial amount of money, and you're going to need to take about $300,000 out of it to even have a chance to affect the tax levy, you're probably going to get into people, or you're going to cut an account like health insurance trust, and you're going to run the chance that you short funded it for the year.
So there's very little fat on the animal. So what is the solution to getting, a beefier budget? You said local aid. Now, you had mentioned in your narrative earlier this week that you had put out that the legislators felt like they had given us some tools to help us rein in costs. So what's your answer to that? And how do you see us getting more local aid from the state? What do we have to do to make that happen?
Well, most of the representatives and senators at an individual level, when you talk to them about it and you share a very specific instance of how what's happened, they're sympathetic to that. The problem is the leadership isn't overly sympathetic to it. So there's that disconnect between Main Street and Beacon Hill. Though your local rep might feel your pain, they have no ability to really influence the leadership's decisions that have already been made about local aid. So I don't really have a great answer for that.
Well, I guess we have to hope the economy turns around and the state coffers get really flush with cash, though they are doing much better than they were 4 or 5 years ago.
Their budget's never been higher. It continues to grow at about a 5+% clip. Year over year, it started to recover in fiscal 12. So all the other things have really recovered in the state budget, including the rainy day account. Yet, one missing, situation is local aid is funded almost 500 million less than 7 years ago.
Mm.
You know.
Well, that's tough, Mr. Mayor. I hope things get a little brighter here. It's tough.
So,
I don't know how these department heads do it. I've talked to several of them myself, and they're juggling to really keep things going. And
yeah.
they deserve a lot of credit for making sure the city still runs on such a restricted budget. But, I just don't see how this goes on for too much longer. Eventually, we're going to be cutting very deeply into the budget. And I think it's really going to hurt the city. And personally, I don't think we can afford to cut at this point. It's just it's going to hurt city services a great deal.
Yeah, if you project out what's the future hold for you, there's a couple things I think that can be done. So one of them is the natural decline of our debt obligation. I gave you the chart in the meeting, the budget narrative, and it shows an incredibly positive trend where just in a few years, the debt sheds exponentially quick. But the danger for anybody in the future is to take that money that you no longer have to appropriate, and you really have to continue to appropriate to fix things. I am amazed since I've been in office, for as much as we've been able to repair, renovate, there is so much more that we have to simply back burner. And you can't continue to operate like that. Bullen Stadium, the baseball stadium, needs about $250,000 worth of repair just to keep it viable. Now, 20 years ago, the football stadium was condemned. It had to be emergency demolished and the aluminum bleachers put up. So those are the planning activities that I've engaged our consultants and department heads with. Is we want to capture as much of this incoming problem so that it doesn't spring up on us. So if local aid doesn't come back, and I don't surmise that it will, then you're left with a couple things where money could be available in the future. One is that debt service as it declines. That would be very tempting to bite into that, but you really need to continue to repair things and keep that number between 6 and 7 million so you can keep the physical plant in good repair. The other one is employee health insurance. Right now for active employees, we're an 80-20 community. And I'm thinking that, in many of the surrounding communities, they're 50-50 or 65-35 or 75-25. I think down the line in the future, the pressure will be great to free up a slug of money. And the only place left in the budget is that health insurance split on active health insurance. So it's going to get probably, for any municipal official, if the state doesn't revisit the local aid situation, more difficult going forward. And you're right, there isn't really an easy way out of that. And I've always said, the budget today is postulated on about $2 million in free cash plus $300,000 in sales tax revenue. It's $2.3 million. That's about the same amount of local aid we're missing from 2008. So if I just had the same local aid from 2008, we wouldn't be in that position.
Now, one solution that you've proposed is a meal tax. How much would that raise each year, roughly?
300,000.
300,000. So not that much.
No, but it's something. And what the legislature will say to you is, well, that's one of the tools we gave you. And I'm sorry if you're late to the party, Westfield, but if you adopted that in 2009, you would have had all these years of 300,000. Well, you're right, but we didn't adopt it in 2009. So I always was against that in 2009 and the idea that, if you think it's such a great idea to raise the meals tax, then raise it to whatever number you want and then give us the formula and distribute it back. Don't put communities against communities. Now, in the grand scheme of things...
What do you mean by that? You mean raise the tax and then cut somewhere else?
Well, what was naturally going to happen is some communities were going to run out and raise the tax while others didn't.
Oh, I see.
Northampton, right? Northampton raised it. Springfield did. Westfield didn't. West Springfield did. Holyoke did. And our restaurant mix in every community is a little bit different. And I can understand West Springfield. They're a huge chain community, and hey, a lot of people coming in to eat in West Springfield are from outside of West Springfield. So that's a big number. It has big impact. But in Westfield, we looked at it in 2009, like not a lot of impact for family restaurants. But now we're at the point where, every year, like, hey, is local aid going to get better? And it didn't. So we need to have a game changer. So.
Well, all right, Mr. Mayor, we covered a lot of territory. If people have questions, or concerns about the budget, what should they do?
They should send an email at mayor@cityofwestfield.org or give us a call at 572-6201.
All right, Mayor Knapik, we appreciate your time.
Thanks. Take care, buddy.
Thank you very much, and good luck.